The wedding breakfast was still laid on the long table when Miss Cecily Hartwell found the letter. She had not gone to the study looking for it. She had gone because the house was loud with toasts, and her sister Dorothea's laughter carried the particular bright note that Cecily had always found difficult to bear in an enclosed room, and because the door at the end of the corridor offered the one place in Alverstone Hall where she might breathe without someone noticing that she was failing to perform happiness convincingly. The study smelled of beeswax and old paper. A coal fire burned low in the grate. She had stood at the window and looked out at the gravel walk where the afternoon light fell in pale November strips, and tried to compose herself into the shape of a woman who wished her sister well. The letter was on the writing desk, half concealed beneath a morocco-bound ledger, and she would not have seen it at all had the ledger not shifted when she leaned against the desk's corner. It fell open to the first line. She read it without meaning to, the way one reads the inscription on a coin found in the street, because the words were there before the intention not to look had time to form. It was addressed to Mr. Philip Crane, Alverstone Hall, Northamptonshire. It was dated the 5th of September, 7 weeks before the wedding. It was signed by a solicitor in Nottingham, a Mr. Fentham, whose firm was known in the county, and it said, in the precise measured language of a man paid to say difficult things plainly, that the party described in Mr. Rackus. Crane's instruction of the 14th of August had been correctly identified, and that the Miss Hartwell, whose company Mr. Farr Crane had sought at the Dovedale Assembly in July, was beyond reasonable doubt Miss Cecily Hartwell of Dovedale Grange, the younger of the two surviving daughters of the late Mr. James Hartwell, and not as Mr. Pratt. Crane appeared to have subsequently believed her elder sister, Miss Dorothea Hartwell, who had not attended that particular assembly. Cecily read it twice. She placed it back beneath the ledger. She walked to the door, opened it, and stood in the corridor for a long moment, with her hand still on the latch. From the dining room at the far end of the hall came a burst of laughter, her sister's voice rising above the rest, and then his low answering murmur, and then the sound of glass meeting glass. She closed the study door behind her and went upstairs to her room. The Hartwell girls had been born on the same morning, Dorothea 11 minutes before Cecily, a fact Dorothea had made central use of for the entirety of their 22 years. They were physically alike in the way that twins are often alike without being identical, sharing the family's auburn hair and the family's dark green eyes and the particular narrow-bridged nose of their father's line, though Dorothea was the one who had always been placed in a room with better light and whose clothes had always been cut to suit her, so that the resemblance operated in public as a matter of degree rather than of duplication. Dorothea was the Hartwell who shone. Cecily was the Hartwell who stood beside the one who shone. Their mother had not intended this arrangement. Their mother had been unwell for most of Cecily's childhood, and their aunt, who had managed the household in her absence, was a woman who believed in organizing available beauty around the most tractable surface, and Dorothea had always been more tractable than Cecily in the precise way that required less maintenance. Cecily read books. Dorothea learned to smile. By the time their mother had recovered sufficiently to notice that one daughter was systematically more visible than the other, the arrangement had calcified. Cecily did not resent it. She had repeated this to herself for long enough that she believed it on most days. She had attended the Dovedale Assembly on the 3rd of July, because their aunt had a summer cold, and Dorothea had not wished to go alone, which was the reason Cecily attended most things. She had worn a borrowed gown, ivory with a sage-green sash, because her own cream muslin had an unrepaired seam, and the borrowed gown fit well enough to serve. She had not expected anything of the evening beyond the usual geography of a county assembly, which was to say she had expected to stand near the refreshment table and watch Dorothea dance. She had not expected Philip Crane. He was not the sort of man who crossed rooms to speak to women who were standing near the refreshment table. He was the sort of man that rooms organized themselves around without being asked, partly because he was the Earl of Alverstone, and partly because he moved through a space with the particular controlled economy of a man who had decided long ago that unnecessary motion was a form of waste. He had dark brown hair and a thin scar through his left brow from a fall in childhood. And when he finally crossed the room, it was in the direction of Cecily, and he had said, in a voice low enough that only she heard it, that she appeared to be the only person in the room who was watching the window rather than the floor, and that he had been trying to determine whether this indicated superior taste or superior boredom, and that he hoped she would tell him which. She had told him it was boredom, and he had laughed, which she had not expected, and they had talked about books for an hour beside the window. And when Dorothea had found her afterwards, she had been flushed in a way she could not quite account for. Dorothea had not asked about it. Cecily had not mentioned the Earl's name. 6 weeks later, Lord Alverstone had called at Dovedale Grange and asked to speak with their aunt about a matter touching Miss Hartwell. He had been shown into the morning room. Dorothea had been in the morning room. The aunt had assumed the obvious. The Earl, presented with a Miss Hartwell who appeared to expect him, had not corrected the assumption. Whether he had recognized his error immediately or only slowly understood it, Cecily could not say. She had been in the garden. By the time she came inside, a courtship had been established. If this is what happens when you consent to attend assemblies you had not wished to attend, Cecily had thought, you cease attending them. She had been at the wedding this morning in a borrowed pearl brooch and a gown. She had altered herself. She had stood behind Dorothea in the church and held the flowers and watched his face when the vows were read, and had told herself, as she told herself most things she needed to believe, that his expression of careful gravity was simply the expression of a man who took oaths seriously, and not the expression of a man working through a calculation he had run out of time to complete. The letter had answered the question she had not permitted herself to ask. If you had not found it, she reminded herself, standing at her bedroom window with November spreading its gray arithmetic across the Northamptonshire fields, you would have gone home tomorrow and said nothing, and this would have been only what it appeared to be, which was your sister's wedding and your own ordinary disappointment. And it would have faded eventually in the way ordinary disappointments do. But she had found it. She sat with this for 3 days. She told no one. She returned to Dovedale Grange with her mother and her aunt, and unpacked her trunk, and resumed the shape of her life there, which was not a difficult shape, because it had always been compact. She read. She called on the Mrs. Fothergill at Beckford, who were pleasant women of limited conversational range, but reliable warmth. She walked the south field in the mornings because the cold helped her think, and her thinking needed considerable assistance. She understood that the letter might mean nothing decisive. Lord Alverstone had employed a solicitor to establish an identification he had then not acted upon. He had married Dorothea anyway. Whatever his original intention had been, it had apparently resolved itself in the direction of the wedding as planned, which suggested that whatever he had felt that July evening in Dovedale, it had been insufficient to alter the shape of his life. This was the rational conclusion, and she returned to it, repeatedly, and she could not make it hold. On the 4th day, a letter arrived from Dorothea, breezy and affectionate in the way Dorothea's correspondence always was, describing the house and the servants and a dinner party planned for the following week, at which Lord and Lady Fenwick were expected, and asking in a postscript, added sideways in the margin, whether Cecily might come for a fortnight because the housekeeper was old-fashioned and the lady's maid she had brought from home was homesick, and it would be so pleasant to have a familiar face. She did not think going would be wise. She wrote back the following morning to say she would arrive on Thursday. If she was honest with herself, which she was not always willing to be, she went because she needed to understand what she was carrying. Whether it was grief for something that had never happened, or guilt for knowing something that was not hers to know, or simply the particular weight of a fact that had no proper home and refused to be set down. She needed to look at them both in the same room and understand what the letter had changed and whether it had changed anything at all. Lord Alverstone met her carriage in the courtyard. He was wearing the navy tailcoat she remembered from the wedding, and the expression she remembered from the assembly, which was the expression of a man who had decided to be careful and had found that carefulness was costing him more than he had budgeted. He handed her down from the carriage with formality. His hand, through her glove, was warm and completely still. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice was even, "you are welcome." "Thank you, my lord," she said. She did not look at him as she said it. This was how the fortnight began. If you are still with the story, and I hope you are, then you already understand what Cecily could not yet name. Leave a note below if you have ever held a secret you could not share with the one person who most needed to know it. Alverstone Hall was a house that suited its master, in the way that houses sometimes suited their owners, not through coziness or warmth, but through proportion. The rooms were large without being wasteful, and the furniture was good without being fashionable, and the library, which occupied the entire west wing of the first floor, smelled of old leather and lamp oil, and had been arranged by someone who actually used it. Which is to say, the arrangement had a logic that declared itself only after you had been in the room long enough to follow it. Cecily spent a great deal of time in the library. She told herself this was because Dorothea preferred the morning room and the music room, and the various bright sociable spaces of the house, and that the library was simply the available territory. She did not entirely believe herself. He found her there on the third morning. She was reading a volume of natural history she had taken from the second shelf, because it was in good condition, and she had always been interested in natural history, and she was sufficiently absorbed that she did not hear the door. What she heard was his voice, low and without ceremony. The second shelf runs to natural philosophy. Natural history begins at the fourth. She looked up. He was standing near the door with a leather-bound document case under one arm, and he was looking at the shelf she had taken the book from with the mild expression of a man who had organized a room to his own precise requirements and was noting that someone had navigated it differently. "I apologize," she said. "The binding suggested natural history." "The binding is misleading," he said. He came into the room and went to the fourth shelf and pulled down a volume without looking at the spine and placed it on the table beside her. Pennant's British Zoology. "If that is the direction of your interest," she looked at the book. She looked at him. He was already moving toward the writing table at the far end of the room. "Thank you," she said. He sat down at the writing table. She returned to her reading. They were in the library together for the better part of an hour, in complete silence, which was not an uncomfortable silence. And this was the first thing she noticed, because silence with people she did not know well was generally uncomfortable, and she did not know him well enough for silence to be anything other than that. She noticed that she noticed this, and she told herself it meant nothing. Dorothea came to find her before luncheon, bright and fond and grateful in a way that was entirely sincere, because Dorothea's fondness, whatever else might be said about her, had always been genuine. She tucked her arm through Cecily's as they walked down the corridor, and said that Philip was attentive in a rather formal way that she supposed would ease over time, and that the house was large, but she was growing accustomed to it, and that Cecily absolutely must stay past the fortnight if she could be persuaded. "He is kind," Dorothea said, with the brisk confidence of someone reporting an observation rather than an emotion. "He is very correct. I think he will be a good husband when he has relaxed into it. He does not talk a great deal." "No," Cecily said. "He does not." Dorothea glanced at her sideways. "You have spoken with him in the library this morning," Cecily said, very briefly. "Good," Dorothea said, and seemed satisfied, and turned the conversation to the Fenwick dinner which was scheduled for the following Friday, and at which Lady Fenwick, who was apparently a woman of opinions, would hold court in the way she always did. And Dorothea was concerned about the seating arrangement. The dinner was 12 people. Lady Fenwick was indeed opinionated. She was also, Cecily discovered, a woman of considerable intelligence, who had the habit of directing pointed remarks at the person least prepared to receive them, which meant that she turned her attention to Cecily approximately 20 minutes into the first course. "Miss Hartwell," she said across the centerpiece, "the younger Miss Hartwell, you attended the Dovedale Assembly this past July, I believe." The table had not stilled, but Cecily felt, or perhaps only imagined, that a small radius of attention contracted around the remark. I did, she said. Charming occasion, Lady Fenwick said pleasantly. It is curious how much of one's important history is made in ordinary rooms. Do you not find it so? Lord Elverstone. Lord Elverstone was at the head of the table. He was watching Lady Fenwick with the neutral attentiveness of a man who has had occasion to observe over some years that Lady Fenwick's pleasantnesses are not always pleasant. I find that ordinary rooms frequently conceal significant events, he said. His voice was perfectly level. It is one of their primary uses. Lady Fenwick smiled. Precisely so, she said, and turned to the gentleman on her right, and the radius of attention dissolved. She did not look at him for the remainder of the first course. She looked at him once during the second, because she could not help it, and she found that he was not looking at her, which was exactly what she would have expected, and which she found left her with a bruise behind the sternum she had not anticipated. She had come to understand over the 12 days she had now been at Alverstone Hall, that what the letter had named was not only the error in his courtship, but the precise origin of a loss she had not been permitted to experience because it had never, technically, been hers. She had met a man at an assembly and spoken with him for an hour, and he had laughed and looked at the window with her and then vanished, and what she had told herself for the weeks that followed was that this was simply the shape of most pleasant evenings, which was to say that they ended and were succeeded by other evenings that were less pleasant. And one adjusted. She had adjusted. She had been very nearly finished with adjusting. She would have finished completely, she thought, if he had been different. But he was not different. He was, in fact, exactly the kind of man she had suspected at the assembly, which was the particular difficulty. He was careful with the servants. He was precise about his accounts. He knew the name of every tenant on the estate and had asked, that morning, after the oldest of them by name, and had listened to the steward's answer with the full attention of a man for whom the answer was not procedural. He had put the right book in her hands without ceremony. He had not made the silence uncomfortable. These were not large things. They were the kind of thing only noticed by someone who was paying the wrong kind of attention. On the 13th day, she found the dowager. Or rather, the dowager found her. Lady Alverstone, his mother, had arrived the previous evening for an unannounced visit of undetermined length, and she was a woman of the kind for whom an unannounced visit was simply the form a visit took when one did not consider one's presence to require announcement. She was stout and upright, with white hair dressed high, and the pale blue eyes that Philip had inherited and sharpened, and she had looked at Cecily over the breakfast table that first morning with the attention of a woman calibrating a variable she had not expected to find in the equation. "The younger Miss Hartwell," she said. "Dorothea tells me you have been here nearly a fortnight." "Nearly so," Cecily said. "Longer than a courtesy visit. Dorothea asked me to stay." Lady Alverstone set down her cup. "Dorothea asks a great many people to stay," she said with the precision of a woman who has spent 30 years governing the tone of rooms. "She is sociable in the way that requires an audience. You are not sociable in that way, Miss Hartwell. I find that you are here for a different reason." Cecily met her eyes. "I am here because my sister wanted company." "Of course you are," Lady Alverstone said with a smile that did not indicate agreement. She picked up her cup again. "I wonder if you play pianoforte." "Tolerably," Cecily said. "Philip plays rather well. He gave it up after his father died. The estate required his full attention, and he concluded that playing the pianoforte was not a productive use of that attention." She paused. "I believe he was wrong. He did not ask my opinion." Cecily did not know what to do with this information, and said nothing. "I am told," Lady Alverstone said, "that the two of you spent a considerable portion of yesterday morning in the library." "We were each reading," Cecily said. "We barely spoke." "Yes," said Lady Alverstone. "That is what I was told." She rose from the table, in the manner of a woman who has concluded an interview. "I should like to hear you play this afternoon, Miss Hartwell, if you are willing." She was not asked again about the length of her visit. She ought to have gone home. She knew she ought to have gone home. She had stayed past the fortnight already, and the excuse of Dorothea's loneliness was thinning. Because Dorothea was not genuinely lonely in the way that required specific company, only in the general way that required an available audience, and any of the Fenwick daughters would have served the purpose equally. She remained because she could not find the right moment to leave, which she recognized as an insufficient reason and which she continued to deploy nonetheless. On the 15th day, the letter's existence became impossible to contain. It happened in the drawing room, on a gray afternoon when the rain had moved in from the west, and the household had contracted around the fire. Dorothea was at the pianoforte, playing with the competent lightness that characterized her approach to most things, and Lady Alverstone was working a piece of embroidery in the chair nearest the window, and Lord Alverstone was standing at the far end of the room with a letter in his hand that he had been ostensibly reading for some time without. As far as Cecily could observe his eyes moving, Lady Alverstone said without looking up from her embroidery, "Miss Hartwell, you have something to say." It was not phrased as a question. Dorothea's playing continued, unhurried, her back to the room. Cecily said, quietly enough, that only Lady Alverstone could hear, "I am not certain what you mean." "I mean," Lady Alverstone said in the same quiet voice and with the same even stitching, "that you have had something to say for 15 days and you have been conducting a very creditable performance of not saying it, and I would prefer that you said it." He had lowered the letter. He was watching Cecily, with the gray still eyes she had been avoiding, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had not been listening. Dorothea played through a flourished cadence and stopped. "I shall get the sheet music from the morning room," she announced to the room generally, and went out, and the door closed behind her with the decisive quality of Dorothea moving towards something she wanted. The three of them were alone. Cecily said to the fire, rather than to either of them. There was a letter. He put down the letter he was holding. "In the study," she said, "on the morning of the wedding from a Mr. Fentham of Nottingham." A silence. "I did not take it," she said. "I replaced it where I found it. I read it because it was in front of me before I understood what it was." Lady Alverstone had set down her embroidery. He said, "Miss Hartwell." His voice was very quiet. "I know that it may mean nothing definitive," she said, still to the fire because looking at him was not something she could do at this exact moment. "I know that you married Dorothea, and that whatever you had intended, your intention resolved in that direction. I am not suggesting that it ought to have resolved differently. I am not, in fact, suggesting anything. I am only telling you, because I cannot continue to be here knowing that I know it, and that you do not know that I know it, and that seemed to me the only honest course." "It is the only honest course," he said. She looked at him then because the evenness of his voice demanded it. He was standing very still. The scar through his left brow had always made his expression difficult to read from certain angles, but she was close enough now to read it clearly, and what she read was not the calculation she had braced for, but something that sat several floors beneath calculation. Something she did not have an immediate name for, but which the body in its animal accuracy named immediately in the form of a flush at the back of her throat and a heartbeat she could feel in her wrists. "I employed Fentham in September," he said, "because I had understood, upon reflection, that the assembly in July had been attended by you, and not by your sister, and I wished to confirm that understanding before I acted on it." "And then you did not act on it," she said. "I arrived at Dovedale Grange," he said, "and your sister was in the morning room." "Yes." "Your aunt presented her." "Yes." "I had the identification in my coat pocket," he said. "I did not produce it. I told myself in the morning room that the identification had been a private inquiry, and that I had no legitimate grounds on which to introduce it as a correction to a social situation already in progress, and that your sister was before me and was a perfectly suitable match, and that the assembly had been a single evening." He paused. "I told myself this several times." Cecily said nothing. "I was," he said, "not entirely convinced by the argument. I proceeded, because proceeding was easier than the alternative, and because the alternative required me to name what had happened in Dovedale, and I was not prepared to name it." He looked at her with the directness of a man who had run out of room for indirection. "I should have been prepared." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the rain moved against the windows in slow gray sheets. Lady Alverstone said from her chair with the inflection of a woman saying a thing she had been holding for some days. "Philip." He looked at his mother. "You are describing the wrong woman as the suitable match," Lady Alverstone said with considerable precision. A silence. "Yes," he said. Cecily stood up. "This does not alter anything," she said, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect from it. "Dorothea is your wife. Whatever the origin of the courtship, it is not the sort of error that can be corrected, and I would not ask it to be. I told you, because I could not stay without telling you. Not because I had any expectation of what the telling would produce." He crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped before her at a distance that propriety permitted and no closer. He did not reach for her. You said in the voice he used when he was saying something he had decided was final. "Miss Hartwell, Cecily." Her given name in his voice was a different syllable than it had ever been in anyone else's. "I know what I have done," he said. "I know what it has cost. I am not asking you to undo any of it, or to alter your understanding of what is possible. I am telling you because you told me the honest thing, and you deserve the honest return, that the reason the library is easier with you in it than it has ever been without you is not the result of natural history or Pennant's zoology, and that the evening in Dovedale was not, for me, simply an evening." She held very still. "That is all I am telling you," he said. The door opened. Dorothea returned with the sheet music, bright and uncurious, in the way she always was when she had been out of a room for long enough to consider. She had missed nothing significant, and said something about the difficulty of locating the second book of the set, and went back to the pianoforte. Lady Alverstone picked up her embroidery. He returned to the far end of the room. Cecily sat down. She left Alverstone Hall 2 days later on a morning of clear, cold light that made the gravel walk look freshly pressed and the stone facade look older than she had noticed before. And Lord Alverstone handed her into the carriage with the same correct formality he had used on her arrival, and said the same words, "You are welcome," in the same even voice. Except that now she understood that he did not use words carelessly, and that welcome was for him both a formality and a precise statement of fact. She did not look back as the carriage moved down the drive. She looked forward at the road, which was the only direction available to her, and she allowed herself, for the duration of the journey home, to feel the full exact weight of what she was carrying, which was not quite grief, because grief requires the loss of something held, and she had not held it. It was something that occupied the space grief would have inhabited if she had been less careful, which was to say it was almost the same thing and required almost the same work. She returned to Dovedale. She resumed her life. She walked the Southfield. She called on the Fothergill sisters. She read. In the new year, a letter arrived from Lady Alverstone, written in the compact, controlled hand of a woman who had decided to say something and was saying it without ornament. It informed Cecily that the previous autumn's accounts had revealed that the Alverstone entail included a dower cottage at the east edge of the estate currently unoccupied, and that Lady Alverstone had decided to take up residence there in the spring and wished to have a companion for the summer months, and that she would be grateful if Miss Cecily might consider the position, which would be a paid engagement of 3 months with the option to extend. Cecily read the letter twice. She understood precisely what it offered and precisely what it did not offer, and she understood that accepting it would be an act of either courage or folly, and that the difference between the two was not always clear from the inside of the choice. She wrote back the following morning to say she would come in May. This was not the end of anything. It was not the beginning of anything she could yet name with certainty. It was simply the only honest next step available to a woman who had already taken the hardest one, which was to say the truth into a room without knowing what the room would do with it. May came as May does in Northamptonshire, with a slowness that is almost reluctant, the cold holding longer than is strictly necessary, and then releasing all at once into warmth that arrives like a decision. The dower cottage was small and white-windowed, and stood at the edge of a kitchen garden that had been neglected through the winter, and was already beginning to reclaim itself in the disorganized optimism of early spring. Cecily planted the garden in the first week because the housekeeper said it was not her place, and Cecily said she would plant it anyway, and Lady Alverstone said nothing about this from the chair in the sitting-room window where she spent her mornings reading, which meant she approved. He came to the cottage on the third Tuesday. He came ostensibly to consult with Lady Alverstone on a matter of the estate, which was the correct pretext, and he and his mother spoke for 20 minutes in the sitting-room while Cecily was in the garden. And then his mother went upstairs for her afternoon rest, and he came to the door of the garden, which was open, and stood in it. She was pulling dead growth from the herb bed. She did not look up immediately. "The rosemary is salvageable," she said. "I hoped it might be," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He looked different in May than he had in November, which was not a meaningful observation, because everyone looks different in May than in November. But on him the difference was particular. Some of the calculated carefulness had eased, not disappeared, because she understood by now that the carefulness was constitutional, and not a posture, but eased, the way a tightly held muscle eases when the effort it has been making. "Dorothea has written," she said. "She seems well." "She is well," he said. "She is in Bath with the Featherington cousins until July." A pause. "You know why I accepted your mother's invitation," she said. "I know why you accepted it," he said. "I do not know what I expect from it." "Nor do I," he said. "But I know what I am permitted to offer, which is precisely this, which is to say your presence here is not an accident and is not a social nicety, and that I intend within every limit the situation imposes to demonstrate that I know the difference between the right Miss Hartwell and the wrong one, and that I have known the difference since July of last year, and that I am sorrier than I have words for that I did not say so sooner." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a great deal," she said. "It is all I have," he said. She got to her feet and brushed the earth from her gloves, and he was standing in the doorway and she was standing in the garden, and the distance between them was exactly the width of a threshold, which is very small and at the same time very significant, depending on which direction you are standing. She stepped forward. He held out his hand, not to take hers, but in the manner of an offer, and she put her gloved hand in his, and he looked at her with the gray, still eyes, and the thin scar through the left brow, and the expression of a man who had spent 9 months learning what it cost to be imprecise about what mattered, and who had no intention of repeating the lesson. He said her name. Just that. The kitchen garden was warm in the May light. A thrush was working in the elm at the east wall. The rosemary stood in its bed, already putting out the first blue flowers. Steady and fragrant and resolutely alive, despite the neglect of winter, and she thought that this was a reasonable description of certain other things as well. Whatever came next, whatever the season and the hierarchy and the limits of the situation made possible, the tally of the year had shifted, and she knew the difference. She had told the truth in a difficult room, and the truth had remained true, which is the most one can ask of a truth, and she had walked toward the only honest door available, and the door had been there. That autumn, Lady Alverstone decided not to return to the main house for the winter. She informed her son of this decision in October in the compact, controlled hand of a woman who had spent 58 years saying what she meant, and saw no reason to stop. And she informed him further that she required a companion for the winter months as well, and that she had extended the arrangement with Miss Cecily with her full agreement, and that she expected him to call on Tuesdays and Thursdays as the estate business required. He called on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on most Saturdays, and occasionally on Fridays. And the estate provided sufficient business to justify each visit if one did not examine the schedule too closely. In November of that year, a full 12 months after the wedding breakfast, Lord Alverstone spoke to Mr. Brad, Fentham in Nottingham regarding a second matter, and then called at the cottage on a Thursday afternoon, and stood in the sitting-room doorway, and said to Cecily, in the voice he used for things that were final, that he had a question he needed to ask her, and that the question could not be asked in the present situation, but that it had an answer he was prepared to wait a considerable time to receive, if she was willing to allow him that much. She said she was willing. The sitting-room fire was burning. Outside the window, the November fields spread in gray and gold, bare and patient and exactly as they had been the year before, which is the quality of Northamptonshire fields, that they do not hurry. Lady Alverstone was embroidering in the chair by the window and was, as far as could be determined, entirely absorbed in her work. Cecily sat with the weight of the year in her hands, like the worn pennant volume from the library shelf, dog-eared and solid, and given to her without ceremony by someone who had known what she needed before she had asked for it, and she thought that this was the shape of being known, which is that it does not announce itself. It simply arrives. And the room is different after she had found a letter that was not meant for her. She had told the truth about it into a room that did not know what to do with the truth. And here, in this small white cottage in November, with the rosemary, in its bed outside and the fire in the grate, and the woman in the chair who had arranged for all of it, with the surgical precision of a dowager who had also evidently known the difference, she allowed herself to believe that the honest path was not always the most painful one. Sometimes it was simply the longest one, and sometimes the longest one was the right one. If this story has stayed with you, leave it a note below. Thank you for remaining until the end.